So in the previous video, we spoke about the local effects of cytokines, specifically IL-1 beta, TNF-alpha, CXCL8, IL-6. They have an effect locally upon infection, right? Macrophage detects infections, produces and releases these cytokines, and these cytokines can act locally to help clear the infection, which is great. But these cytokines can also enter the circulatory system, get into the bloodstream, and can be carried to distant sites that also have receptors for some of these proteins. And so these effects, we call these systemic effects because they tend to be not local to the site of infection, but they can be in other parts of the body. They can affect the entire body. So let's introduce some systemic effects of these cytokines. So the first place we'll talk about cytokines going are the hypothalamus. So an infection locally in some part of the body can be recognized by macrophages. The macrophages release these cytokines like IL-1, beta, TNF-alpha, IL-6, and those can go to the hypothalamus. Cells in the hypothalamus have receptors for these cytokines, and the hypothalamus, does many things. One thing it does is it controls body temperature, and so the fact that fever is triggered after infections is due to low cytokines being released from sites of infections, often by macrophages. So uh, that can increase the body temperature, the hypothalamus. Also, these cytokines can react with other receptors uh, systemically throughout the body on fat and muscle cells. We talked about it interacting locally to increase local temperature, but it can also really bind to fat and muscle cells throughout the body to increase overall body temperature. So, and again, the response of fever and increasing temperature in the body is thought to help the immune response because pathogens tend not to replicate at higher temperatures as efficiently, and immune cells, some of them, actually function more efficiently at higher temperatures. The other thing that we want to talk about now is the um, effect of IL-6 on the liver. So IL-6, interleukin 6, released by macrophages locally upon infection, can get in the circulatory system, travel throughout the body. On hepatocytes, liver cells, they have IL-6 receptor. And they're going to, when IL-6 binds the IL-6 receptor, can get the liver to turn on genes and produce proteins that are going to help the immune response. And so we're going to call these proteins acute phase proteins. So acute phase proteins, we've got an acute infection. We got to get rid of this infection. Let's make these proteins, and hopefully these proteins are going to contribute to getting rid of the pathogen. So we're going to learn about a couple of acute phase proteins, two of which are called CRP and MBL. So CRP stands for C-reactive protein. MBL stands for mannose-binding lectin. So these proteins are only made upon recognition of an infection in the body, and the body is in this inflammatory state. The liver is producing these proteins, again, because the liver is being exposed to cytokines such as IL-6. CRP is a very common protein analyzed in blood panels to see if somebody has an active infection. So if there is a pathogen in the body that is triggering an immune response, it often triggers the production of C-reactive protein. Levels go way high in the circulatory system. So if you're ever looking at some blood work, you see them measuring CRP, C-reactive protein, comes from the liver in response to IL-6 production somewhere in the body. And it's a signifier that there's a pathogen somewhere in the body often. We'll talk about the functions of CRP and MBL in later videos. I do want to talk here about another systemic effect of TNF-alpha, right? So tumor necrosis factor alpha. Again, that can have an effect locally on the blood vessels, which are going to help bring more blood and heat and immune cells and fluid to the site of infection. Um, The issue, and now we're going to talk about a deleterious effect of TNF alpha, is that if there's too much of it produced, and this often occurs during sepsis, right? Sepsis refers to when a pathogen like a bacteria has entered the circulatory system. Now the pathogen has the free range throughout the body. We don't want pathogens in our circulatory system, so there are ways to clear this in the spleen and in the liver, which one thinks about almost as like filters of the circulatory system, filters of the blood. The spleen and the liver have many macrophages in them. So those macrophages actually will help phagocytose pathogens found in the circulatory system, right? And we do not want pathogens in the circulatory system. So spleen and liver are their macrophages are phagocytosing pathogens, which is great. But remember, the macrophages have toll-like receptors on the surface. If they're detecting these pathogens in the circulatory system, these macrophages in the spleen and the liver can release high amounts of TNF alpha into the circulatory system. Now, inflammation is good, but too much inflammation is bad, right? A lot of things with the immune system, too much good, too much is bad. Not enough, too much, both bad. So now we're going to talk about too much TNF alpha signaling. High levels of TNF alpha, we talked about TNF alpha in a previous video, causes vascular permeability, brings fluid into sites of infection, vasodilation, I think I spelled that wrong. Blood vessels dilate, bring more blood to the site. Those are all good. But if this is happening systemically throughout the body, if blood vessels throughout the body are exposed to TNF alpha, then these blood vessels are going to become permeable and going to dilate, vasodilate. That's actually very bad because if many blood vessels in the body are becoming permeable and dilate, then a lot of fluid is leaving the circulatory system and entering tissues. So tissues throughout the body start to swell from edema, from the fluid leaving the blood going into the tissues. And if you recall how the circulatory system works, our blood vessels are kept open because of blood pressure, because of the blood inside the vessels are keeping it closed, right? Blood vessels are very floppy. Now, if the blood is leaving the circulatory system because of the increase in vasodilation and also or increased vascular permeability, and these blood vessels are dilating, right? The volume of blood is decreasing. Um, so the blood pressure will drop because there's not enough blood to keep pressure on the walls of the blood vessels. So blood pressure plummets. If blood pressure plummets, that's a sign of septic shock. Um, and what can occur is those blood vessels can collapse because there's not enough pressure to hold them open. If blood vessels collapse, then organs and tissues will lose access to blood and lose access to oxygen, and organs and tissues start to shut down. And so when somebody's going into septic shock, it is often due to collapsing blood vessels. Why are these blood vessels collapsing? Too much inflammation is going on systemically. One of the things that can cause systemic inflammation is an increase in TNF alpha.